When professional boxers fight in the streets, the real consequences, the Harlem Incident, Mike Tyson versus Mitch Green, 1988. In the boxing ring, violence is regulated, timed, supervised, and contained by rules. But outside the ropes, those same hands can become something far more dangerous. Throughout modern boxing history, a handful of incidents have reminded the world of a troubling truth. A professional fighter does not stop being a fighter when the bell is silent. The early hours of 23 August 1988 in Harlem, New York City, provided one of the most infamous examples of what happens when a world champion's fists are deployed outside the controlled environment of a boxing ring. Mike Tyson was 22 years old and at the absolute peak of his powers. He was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, holding the WBA, WBC, and IBF titles simultaneously. His professional record stood at an intimidating 35-0 with 31 knockouts. He demolished every challenger placed in front of him, becoming the youngest heavyweight champion in history at age 20. Tyson wasn't just famous. He was a global phenomenon, earning millions per fight and dominating sports coverage worldwide. Mitch "Blood" Green was a former opponent whom Tyson had defeated on 20th of May 1986 at Madison Square Garden. That bout had gone the full 10 rounds, one of only a handful of fights during Tyson's prime where an opponent survived the distance. Green had fought bravely, but lost a unanimous decision. In the 2 years since, he'd continued boxing with mixed results, never achieving the championship success he'd hoped for. But Green harbored resentments that extended beyond his ring loss to Tyson. He believed he'd been underpaid for the Madison Garden fight, that promoter Don King had exploited him financially, and that Tyson had been complicit in that exploitation. These grievances festered, fueled by the stark contrast between Tyson's meteoric success and Green's own struggling career. The confrontation began outside Dapper Dan's, a legendary Harlem boutique that was open around the clock and served as a gathering place for hip-hop artists, athletes, and celebrities. Accounts vary regarding exactly how the encounter started. Some witnesses reported that Green approached Tyson's car as the champion pulled up to the shop. Others suggested the two men encountered each other inside the boutique and the argument spilled onto the street. What's undisputed is that Green confronted Tyson about money, accusing the champion and Don King of cheating him. The conversation quickly escalated from argument to confrontation. Voices rose, accusations flew. A crowd gathered, drawn by the spectacle of two heavyweight boxers squaring off on a Harlem street in the middle of the night. Then the violence began. According to multiple witnesses and later court testimony, Tyson threw the first punch, a right hand that struck Green in the face with the full force of a man who'd knocked out most of his professional opponents. The punch opened a significant gash on Green's face, badly damaged his eye, and cut his nose severely enough to require medical attention. Green, despite being struck by one of the hardest punches in heavyweight history, remained standing, a testament to the toughness that had allowed him to survive 10 rounds with Tyson in their official bout. He fought back, and the two men exchanged blows on the street, whilst the crowd watched and, by some accounts, encouraged the violence. Tyson later admitted in interviews that during the altercation he'd attempted a spinning kick, a move completely outside boxing's permitted techniques. He wouldn't go down, Tyson explained years later, describing his frustration that his punches weren't immediately ending the fight as they did in the ring. The attempt at a kick suggests how the confrontation had devolved beyond anything resembling regulated sport into a genuine street brawl. The fight was eventually broken up, though accounts differ on whether police intervention ended it or whether the combatants simply separated. Green required medical treatment for his facial injuries. But ironically, it was Tyson who suffered the more consequential physical damage. He'd fractured his right hand during the altercation. For a professional boxer, particularly a heavyweight champion scheduled for high-profile fights worth millions of pounds. A fractured hand is a career-threatening injury. Tyson's next scheduled bout was against Frank Bruno, the British heavyweight contender, set for later that year. The fight was highly anticipated and would generate enormous revenue for promoters, broadcasters, and the fighters themselves. The hand injury forced postponement of the Bruno fight from its original date, disrupting carefully planned promotional schedules and costing all involved parties significant money. The bout was eventually rescheduled for February 1989, with Tyson defeating Bruno by fifth-round technical knockout. But the delay caused by a street fight created complications far beyond the immediate medical concern. The legal consequences proved even more significant than the hand injury. Mitch Green filed a civil lawsuit against Mike Tyson, seeking damages for the assault. The case proceeded through the courts, with Green's legal team arguing that Tyson, as a professional heavyweight champion, had used disproportionate force against someone who, whilst also a professional fighter, was clearly not Tyson's equal in terms of skill, power, or current competitive standing. The jury found in Green's favour, initially awarding him substantial damages widely reported to be in the millions of dollars, though the exact amount was reduced on appeal. The verdict established an important legal precedent that would influence how courts treated assault cases involving professional fighters. Their training and skill level could be considered aggravating factors when assessing liability and damages. Legal consequences. Why fighters are judged differently. The verdict in Mitch Green's lawsuit against Mike Tyson established a legal principle that extends far beyond that single incident. Professional fighters are often judged more harshly in assault cases because their training implies a greater capacity to cause harm. This raises a fundamental question that courts in multiple jurisdictions have wrestled with for decades. Should elite fighting skill become a legal liability the moment violence leaves the ring? The answer, according to established legal precedent in the United States, United Kingdom, and numerous other countries, is nuanced, but generally yes, though not in the way popular mythology suggests. A persistent myth claims that professional boxers must register their hands as lethal weapons, or that their fists are legally classified as deadly weapons. This is categorically false. No such registration requirement exists in any jurisdiction. Boxers' hands are not legally classified differently from anyone else's hands. However, the reality is more subtle and, in practical terms, potentially more consequential for fighters. Courts consistently consider professional combat training an aggravating factor when assessing the proportionality of force in assault cases. The legal reasoning is straightforward. A trained fighter knows precisely what their punch can do. They understand the mechanics of generating power, the vulnerable targets on the human body, and the potential consequences of strikes delivered with full force. This knowledge creates a higher standard of responsibility. In civil cases, like Green v. Tyson, this principle manifests in several ways. Juries are often instructed to consider the defendant's training and skill level when assessing whether the force used was reasonable under the circumstances. A professional heavyweight champion striking an opponent, even another professional fighter, with full force in a non-regulated environment can be viewed as using disproportionate force, particularly if the victim was not actively threatening serious harm at the moment of the punch. Damages in such cases can increase significantly. The Green verdict reportedly awarded substantial compensation, though the exact final amount after appeals was never fully disclosed publicly. The initial award was rumored to be several $1 million, reflecting not just the physical injuries sustained, but also the implicit recognition that Tyson, as one of the most dangerous punchers in boxing history, should have exercised greater restraint. In criminal cases, the stakes are even higher. Whilst assault charges against professional fighters don't automatically escalate to aggravated assault solely because of their training, Prosecutors often argue that the fighter's skill level should be considered when determining the severity of charges and potential sentences. A punch that might be charged as simple assault when thrown by an average person could potentially be charged as assault with a deadly weapon or aggravated assault when thrown by a professional fighter, particularly if serious injury results. Self-defense claims face heightened scrutiny when advanced by professional fighters. The legal standard for self-defense typically requires that the force used be proportionate to the threat faced. For a trained fighter, this creates a paradox. Their superior skills mean they often have options for defending themselves that don't require striking with full power. Courts may expect fighters to use lesser force, restraining techniques, defensive blocking, or controlled strikes, rather than immediately deploying their most devastating punches. This principle was tested in several cases beyond Tyson Green. In the United Kingdom, there have been multiple instances where professional boxers faced legal consequences for street violence. The courts have consistently held that a boxer's training creates a duty to exercise greater restraint than an ordinary citizen might be expected to show in similar circumstances. The financial consequences extend far beyond court judgments and potential criminal fines. For active professional fighters, involvement in street violence can trigger a cascade of career-damaging consequences. Cancelled fights represent the most immediate financial impact. Tyson's hand injury from the Green incident forced postponement of the Frank Bruno bout, disrupting promotional schedules and potentially costing millions in lost revenue. Such cancellations don't just affect the fighter. They impact promoters, broadcasters, venue operators, and numerous other stakeholders who may seek compensation for their losses. Sponsorship deals often contain morality clauses that allow companies to terminate agreements if the athlete engages in behavior that damages the brand's reputation. Street fighting, regardless of who initiated the confrontation, typically qualifies as reputation-damaging behavior. The loss of sponsorship income can dwarf purse money for top fighters, particularly in the modern era, where endorsement deals often exceed fight earnings. Insurance complications present another financial hazard. Fighters carry various types of insurance: health insurance to cover training and fighting injuries, disability insurance to protect against career-ending damage, and liability insurance to protect against lawsuits. Involvement in unsanctioned violence can trigger policy exclusions, leaving fighters personally liable for medical expenses and legal judgments that would otherwise be covered. Future insurance may become prohibitively expensive or entirely unavailable, creating long-term financial vulnerability. Professional boxing licenses can be suspended or revoked by athletic commissions in response to street violence. In the United States, state athletic commissions have broad authority to discipline licensed fighters for conduct detrimental to the sport. A suspension can prevent a fighter from competing in that jurisdiction, and since major fights are often held in Nevada, New York, or California, being banned from those states effectively ends a championship-level career. International boxing federations can impose similar sanctions that apply globally. The damage to public image, whilst harder to quantify financially, can be equally consequential. Boxing promoters invest heavily in building fighters' marketability. A champion embroiled in street violence loses the hero narrative that drives pay-per-view sales and ticket purchases. Fans may turn against fighters perceived as thugs or bullies. Media coverage shifts from sports pages to crime reporting. The commercial value of a fighter's brand can collapse remarkably quickly when public perception sours. Kimbo Slice and other documented incidents, when the street becomes the stage. Whilst Mike Tyson's confrontation with Mitch Green represented a champion's fall from grace through street violence, Kevin Ferguson, better known as Kimbo Slice, followed the opposite trajectory. His story demonstrates that in the digital age, the street can become not a fighter's downfall, but rather an unconventional entrance ticket to professional combat sports. Born on 8 February 1974 in Nassau, Bahamas, and raised in Miami, Florida, Kevin Ferguson worked various jobs, including as a strip club bouncer before discovering an unexpected path to fame. In the early 2000s, when internet video was still relatively novel and social media platforms didn't yet exist in their current form, Ferguson began participating in unsanctioned street fights that were filmed and uploaded to websites. These weren't random brawls, but rather organized, though still illegal, bar-knuckle fights, often held in backyards or warehouses. Ferguson, fighting under the name Kimbo Slice, displayed genuine fighting ability combined with devastating knockout power. The videos spread virally across the early internet, passed from person to person via email and file-sharing platforms. Within months, millions of people had watched Kimbo Slice's brutal street fights, making him one of the internet's first viral sensations. The most famous of these videos showed Kimbo defeating a fighter named Big D in a backyard bout that lasted mere seconds before Kimbo landed a devastating punch. Another widely circulated video featured a longer, more competitive fight against a fighter known as Gannon, which showcased Kimbo's ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. The raw, unregulated nature of these bouts fascinated viewers, while simultaneously raising serious ethical and legal questions. Promoters, particularly in mixed martial arts, quickly recognized the commercial potential. Kimbo Slice had something that couldn't be manufactured through traditional marketing: genuine street credibility and a built-in audience of millions who'd followed his unsanctioned fighting career. In 2007, he made his professional MMA debut with Elite XC, a promotion that saw him as a potential crossover star who could attract mainstream attention to the sport. His MMA career was mixed. Kimbo won several early fights against limited opposition, but when matched against elite competition, his lack of formal training in grappling and ground fighting became apparent. He was defeated by Seth Petruzzelli in October 2008 in a fight that effectively ended Elite XC as a promotion. The loss exposed the reality that street fighting skills, whilst impressive, weren't sufficient against properly trained mixed martial artists. However, Kimbo then transitioned to professional boxing, where his striking background proved more applicable. From 2011 to 2013, he compiled an undefeated record of 7-0 with 6 knockouts, demonstrating that his punching power translated effectively into the regulated sport. Whilst he never faced elite opposition, his boxing career proved more successful than his MMA tenure. Kimbo Slice's story raises profound questions about the relationship between street fighting and professional combat sports. Should unsanctioned violence ever be a pathway into regulated competition? His success, and the financial rewards it brought him, arguably created perverse incentives. If street fighting videos can lead to professional contracts worth hundreds of thousands of pounds, does that encourage dangerous, illegal activity? The ethical concerns are significant. The fights that made Kimbo famous involved no medical supervision, no safety protocols, and no regulatory oversight. Participants risked serious injury or death for small amounts of money and internet fame. That such activity could be monetized and leveraged into a legitimate career sends a troubling message about the boundaries between sanctioned and unsanctioned violence. Yet Kimbo's defenders argue that he made the best of difficult circumstances. Born into poverty, facing limited opportunities, he used his natural fighting ability and the emerging technology of internet video to create opportunities that wouldn't have otherwise existed. His success story, viewed from this angle, represents entrepreneurship and self-promotion rather than glorification of violence. Kimbo Slice died on 6th of June 2016 from heart failure at age 42, leaving behind a complicated legacy that continues to generate debate within combat sports communities. Beyond Tyson Green and Kimbo Slice's unique path, numerous other documented incidents illustrate the dangers when professional fighters engage in street violence. In 2019, former two-division UFC champion BJ Penn was involved in a highly publicized street altercation outside a bar in Honolulu, Hawaii. Video footage captured by witnesses and widely shared on social media showed Penn, visibly intoxicated, being knocked unconscious during the confrontation. The incident was particularly shocking because Penn, despite being past his competitive prime, was still an elite-trained fighter with decades of experience. The video demonstrated that outside the controlled environment of regulated competition, even world-class fighters are vulnerable to sucker punches, multiple attackers, and the chaos of street confrontations. Penn's humiliation was compounded by the viral spread of the footage, which has been viewed millions of times. In another tragic case, Bulgarian amateur boxer Evgeny Borisov reportedly suffered severe injuries during a street assault in Sofia involving multiple attackers in 2012. The attack damaged his hands and caused skull fractures severe enough to require hospitalization. More devastatingly, the injuries effectively ended his Olympic aspirations. Borisov had been considered a medal contender for Bulgaria, but was never able to return to his previous form. Borisov's case illustrates a particularly cruel irony. Whilst professional fighters are held to higher legal standards when they engage in violence, they're just as vulnerable as anyone else when they're the victims. Their fighting skills may actually put them at greater risk, as potential attackers may view defeating a trained fighter as a way to prove their own toughness. The injuries sustained can be career-ending in ways that might merely be painful for non-athletes. These incidents, spread across decades and continents, reinforce several consistent truths about street violence involving professional fighters. First, the absence of regulation means no protection, no referee to stop excessive punishment, no medical staff to treat injuries immediately, no rules preventing the use of weapons or prohibiting multiple attackers joining the fight. Legal, ethical, and cultural implications, the higher standard. The documented cases of street violence involving professional fighters, from Mike Tyson's Harlem confrontation to BJ Penn's public humiliation to Kimbo Slice's unconventional rise, collectively raise a question that extends beyond individual incidents. Should professional fighters be held to a higher standard than ordinary citizens when violence occurs outside the ring? The answer from legal systems across multiple jurisdictions is increasingly clear. Yes, but the reasoning is more nuanced than simple punishment for possessing dangerous skills. Courts have developed a sophisticated framework for addressing violence by trained fighters that balances several competing considerations. The principle of proportionality sits at the heart of this framework. In self-defense law, individuals are generally permitted to use force proportionate to the threat they face. For an average person confronted by an aggressive attacker, throwing a punch might be entirely reasonable and legally justified. For a professional heavyweight boxer in the same situation, that same punch could be deemed excessive because their training provides alternative options, restraint techniques, defensive positioning, or controlled strikes that neutralize the threat without causing serious harm. This creates what legal scholars call an elevated duty of care. Just as doctors are held to higher standards than laypeople when providing medical assistance, and just as trained security professionals face greater scrutiny when using force, professional fighters are expected to exercise judgment that reflects their superior understanding of violence. A boxer knows, with far greater precision than an untrained person, exactly how much force is required to stop an attacker versus how much force might cause permanent injury or death. The Mike Tyson-Mitch Green case exemplified this principle. Tyson's defense argued that he'd been confronted aggressively and had responded proportionately. The jury disagreed, finding that Tyson, as one of the most devastating punchers in boxing history, should have exercised greater restraint. The implicit message was clear: extraordinary skill creates extraordinary responsibility. This legal framework reflects broader societal expectations about the relationship between power and responsibility. We expect those with greater capacity to cause harm, whether police officers, martial arts instructors, or professional fighters, to exercise greater judgment about when and how to deploy that capacity. The alternative, treating a professional fighter's punch the same as an untrained person's push, would ignore the vast difference in potential consequences. However, this elevated standard creates genuine challenges for fighters. In chaotic street confrontations, where adrenaline surges and split-second decisions must be made, expecting perfect judgment may be unrealistic. A fighter who's attacked may instinctively respond with the techniques drilled into them through thousands of hours of training. Should they be legally punished for reflexive actions that, whilst violent, may be the natural result of their conditioning? Some legal experts argue that the current framework places unfair burdens on fighters, particularly when they're genuine victims of unprovoked attacks. If someone assaults a professional boxer, expecting the boxer to respond with carefully calibrated, minimal force whilst under attack seems to demand superhuman restraint. This concern has led to calls for legal reforms that provide clearer safe harbors for fighters acting in legitimate self-defense. The cultural implications extend beyond courtrooms. Professional combat sports exist in a complicated relationship with broader society's attitudes towards violence. Boxing, MMA, and other fighting sports are legal, regulated, and commercially successful specifically because they're contained within strict frameworks that distinguish sport from assault. When fighters engage in street violence, they blur those boundaries, potentially undermining the legitimacy of their sports. Promoters and athletic commissions understand this danger acutely. Their businesses depend on maintaining the distinction between sanctioned competition and criminal violence. When fighters brawl in the streets, they provide ammunition to critics who argue that combat sports glorify and normalize violence. This explains why athletic commissions often impose harsh suspensions for street fighting. They're protecting not just public safety, but the viability of their industry. The financial incentives created by modern media complicate these issues further. The Kimbo Slice phenomenon demonstrated that street fighting videos, if they generate sufficient viral attention, can become pathways to professional contracts. This creates perverse incentives, particularly for young men in economically disadvantaged communities who may see unsanctioned fighting as their best opportunity for fame and financial success. Social media has amplified these dynamics exponentially. Where once street fights might be witnessed by dozens of people, today they're filmed on smartphones and shared with millions within hours. The BJ Penn incident gained far more attention than it would have in pre-digital eras, not because the altercation was particularly significant, but because video documentation made it shareable entertainment. This raises ethical questions about society's complicity in promoting street violence. When millions of people watch and share videos of fighters being humiliated or injured in unsanctioned brawls, we're creating market demand for such content. This demand, in turn, incentivizes more filming, more sharing, and potentially more violence committed specifically for viral distribution. The psychological toll on fighters involved in street violence is often overlooked in discussions focused on legal and financial consequences. Mike Tyson's life spiraled dramatically in the years following his peak, with the Mitch Green incident representing just one of many troubling episodes. His later reflections on that period reveal a man struggling with fame, wealth, and the violent impulses that had made him successful in the ring, but destructive outside it. For fighters on the opposite end, those attacked rather than attacking, the psychological damage can be equally severe. BJ Penn's public humiliation likely affected his mental health and self-perception in ways that extended far beyond the physical injuries sustained. The knowledge that millions have watched you being knocked unconscious creates a form of psychological trauma distinct from the violence itself. Boxing teaches control, discipline, and precision. The sport at its best represents violence elevated to art form, where skill and strategy matter more than simple aggression. But history repeatedly demonstrates that when that control slips outside the ropes, whether through Mike Tyson's fractured hand, Evgeny Borisov's shattered Olympic dreams, or BJ Penn's viral humiliation, the consequences can be devastating. The question of whether professional fighters should be held to higher standards ultimately reflects broader questions about power, responsibility, and the social contract. Those given exceptional abilities, whether through training, natural talent, or both, carry exceptional obligations to use those abilities responsibly. This principle applies to fighters as much as it applies to anyone else granted special capabilities, because in boxing, the most dangerous place for a champion may not be the ring. It may be the street, where there are no referees, no rounds, no medical checks, only consequences.